3 generations. That is all it took. 3 generations between Noah, the most righteous man on earth, the man who walked with God, the man through whom the entire human race was preserved, and his great-grandson Nimrod, who looked at the sky and declared war on the God who lived above it. Noah stepped off the ark onto a silent, empty planet. His great-grandson built the first empire, the first totalitarian state, and the most infamous monument to human arrogance in the history of the world. The speed of that collapse, from salvation to rebellion in 3 generations, should disturb anyone who reads it carefully. Because the Tower of Babel is not a children's story about a tall building and funny languages. It is the account of humanity's first organized theological warfare against heaven, an act of collective defiance so brazen that God himself came down to stop it. And the man who ordered it built was not a misguided idealist. He was a tyrant whose name in the original Hebrew was itself a declaration of revolt. The water had only just receded. The world it left behind was not the world that had existed before. The antediluvian civilization, the cities, the metallurgy, the music, the Nephilim, the violence that had filled the earth, was gone, buried under miles of sediment, dissolved into the geological record of a global catastrophe. What remained was mud, silence, and 8 people standing on a mountain in the region of Ararat with a divine command ringing in their ears. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Fill the earth. Spread out, populate the empty planet, take dominion, but under the authority of the God who had just demonstrated, in terms no one could misunderstand, that he would destroy everything if humanity chose rebellion over obedience. They did not obey. Instead of scattering across the earth as God commanded, they gathered. Instead of spreading outward into the unknown, they moved inward, east, toward a flat, fertile plain between 2 rivers that the Hebrews would call Shinar, the territory history would later know as Sumer, and later still as Babylon. And they stopped. They clustered together. They refused to fill the earth. The command was explicit. The refusal was deliberate. And in the center of that refusal, a man rose whose name was a recruiting slogan for the revolution. His genealogy is laid out in Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, a document so ancient and so geographically precise that archaeologists have used it as a reliable map of the post-flood world. And in that table, wedged between lists of peoples and territories, the text pauses. It interrupts its own rhythm to focus with unusual intensity on a single individual. Genesis 10, 8-12. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Every clause in that passage contains a detonation. Start with the genealogy. Nimrod was the son of Cush. Cush was the son of Ham. Ham was the son of Noah. 3 generations from the man who built the ark to the man who built the tower. 3 steps from salvation to tyranny. His name. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, names were not arbitrary labels. They were theological statements, prophecies, declarations of identity and intent. The name Nimrod derives from the root marad, to rebel. Depending on the grammatical construction, the name means either he who rebelled or, in its cohortative form, let us rebel. A first-person plural incitement. His very name was a call to arms. Whoever named this child looked at him and either prophesied or desired that he would be the leader of a revolt, not against an earthly king, but against God. The text calls him a Gibor, a mighty one. This is the same Hebrew word used in Genesis 6 to describe the Nephilim, the mighty beings whose violence had provoked the flood. The literary echo is deliberate. The author of Genesis is telling us the same spirit of domination that had corrupted the old world was rising again, concentrated in a single man, barely a century after the floodwaters dried. And then the phrase that Sunday school has softened into something almost complimentary: a mighty hunter before the Lord. The Hebrew is Gibor Tzayid Lifnei Yahweh. The word lifnei, before, carries a dual meaning in Hebrew. It can mean in the presence of, but it can also mean in the face of, against, in defiance of. The Targum of Jonathan ben Uziel, an ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Torah, translates this phrase not as a mighty hunter before the Lord, but as a mighty rebel against the Lord. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan is even more explicit. Nimrod was mighty in sin and rebellion before the Lord. And what was he hunting? The ancient Jewish commentators, the rabbis of the Midrash, Josephus, the authors of the Book of Jasher, are remarkably consistent. He was hunting men, not animals, souls. He hunted human loyalty, human obedience, human worship, and redirected all of it from God toward himself. Nimrod founded the first kingdom in biblical history, Genesis 10:10. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. This was not a village that grew organically into a city. It was a political project, a deliberate consolidation of human power under a single authority independent of the Creator. Then he expanded. He moved north into Assyria and built Nineveh, the city that would later become the capital of the most brutal empire the ancient Near East had ever seen. The empire-building impulse that would define human history for the next 4,000 years, from Assyria to Babylon to Persia to Rome to every imperial project since, began in Shinar under Nimrod, and then came the tower. Genesis 11:1-4. The entire earth had one language and one common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Read that last clause again. Otherwise, we will be scattered. They knew the command, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. They understood that God wanted them to spread, and they explicitly, consciously, deliberately chose to resist. The tower was not merely an architectural project. It was a mechanism of defiance, designed to prevent the very thing God had commanded. The construction technology the text describes is precise, and precisely Mesopotamian. Brick instead of stone. The plain of Shinar had no quarries, no mountains, no source of cut stone. For days the builders debated, searched, dug in vain. The decision to build a tower to the sky had already been made, and nothing would stop them. It was Nimrod who proposed the solution. Let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And so the work began. Multitudes of men set in motion. They built giant kilns, fire chambers fueled by wood and reeds. Day and night, hardened hands molded the clay, pressed it into molds, dried it in the sun, and fired it until the bricks came out hot, hard, and red like the earth itself. Each brick was a declaration. Each layer was a defiance. But bricks alone were not enough. They needed mortar. crews headed toward the natural bitumen wells, where thick black asphalt seeped from the ground in pools like open veins. Using shovels, clay vessels, and ropes, they collected tons of it, hauled it back to the construction site, and used it to bond brick to brick. It was sticky, tough, waterproof, perfect for erecting a structure its builders intended to last for eternity. Archaeologists have confirmed that this exact technique, fired mud bricks bonded with natural bitumen, was the standard construction method in southern Mesopotamia from the earliest recorded periods. The text is describing with documentary accuracy the building technology of the oldest known civilization on Earth. The tower began to rise. The city around it roared like a living organism. Smoke from the furnaces darkened the sky. The sound of hammering, of carts being dragged through mud, of foremen shouting orders in the single language all humanity still shared, filled the plain from sunrise to deep into the night. Ramps of packed earth spiraled upward around the growing structure, wide enough for teams of laborers to carry bricks and bitumen to the upper levels. The construction was not haphazard. It was engineered, each level slightly smaller than the one below, creating the stepped profile that archaeologists would later identify in every surviving ziggurat across Iraq. What were they building? The phrase, "a tower with its top in the heavens," has been misread for centuries as a naive attempt to physically reach God, as though they thought heaven was a location you could access with enough bricks. That is not what the text says. The Hebrew phrase, Rosho Bashamayim, its head in the heavens, is an architectural term found in ancient Mesopotamian building inscriptions. It describes a ziggurat, a stepped temple tower designed as a connection point between earth and the divine realm. The temple at the top was understood as a landing place for the deity, a spot where the god would descend to meet humanity. The builders were not trying to climb into God's living room. They were building a competing religious system, an alternative access point to the divine, a structure that would allow humanity to approach heaven on its own terms, without submission, without the mediating authority of the God who had created them and drowned the world they had corrupted. And the phrase, "let us make a name for ourselves," reveals the deepest motivation of all. In Hebrew, Shem means both name and renown, but it also means identity, legacy, that which survives after you are gone. They were building an alternative to God's plan. God had promised Abraham, not yet born, but already in the divine timeline, that he would make Abraham's name great. The builders of Babel attempted to make their own name great, on their own terms, by their own power. The tower was a declaration of independence from heaven. God's response is recorded with a literary irony so precise it could only be deliberate. Genesis 11:5. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. Came down. The tower that was supposed to reach heaven was so small that God had to descend to see it. The structure they believed would touch the sky did not even register from the divine perspective without a deliberate act of condescension. The irony is architectural. They built up. God came down. They wanted to reach heaven. Heaven had to stoop to notice them. What God saw concerned him, and the reason he gives is not what most people expect. If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. This is not a frightened deity threatened by human engineering. This is the assessment of a creator who understands what unified human ambition, directed away from him, consolidated under a tyrannical system, and operating with a single language, is capable of producing. The pre-flood world had demonstrated where unchecked human capability leads. Total corruption, total violence, total destruction. God had reset the planet once. The Babel project was the first sign that the same trajectory was resuming, and God chose to intervene before the corruption could reach the point of no return again. The intervention was elegant and devastating. God confused their language. The Hebrew word is balal, to mix, to confuse, to jumble. In a single moment, not gradually, not over generations, not through the slow drift of dialects across centuries, the entire linguistic substrate of human civilization shattered. The foreman called for bricks and received blank stares. The engineer gave instructions and was met with alien syllables. A father called to his son across the construction site. The boy stopped, looked confused, spoke, but the father heard sounds he had never encountered, as though his own child had become a stranger. The father tried again. The boy answered again. Neither understood. And then the boy cried, and the father cried too. In the markets at the base of the tower, women began to argue. "That's not what I asked for. You're robbing me. Speak clearly." But nobody could speak clearly to anyone who did not share their new tongue. Stalls overturned. Fruit rolled on the ground. A woman struck another with a basket. Screams, crying, accusations, and no one understood a word. Inside a house, a wife was cooking. Her husband came in and asked about their son. She answered in a language he had never heard. He thought she was mocking him. They argued. She wept. He left. They loved each other, but they could no longer speak. A musician played his flute. He expected others to sing along, as they always had. But no one followed because no one understood the lyrics. Each person was humming a different melody in a different language, a divided soul. The musician lowered his flute, looked around, and understood. The music had died. The priests rushed to the temple at the base of the tower. They lit incense. They raised their hands to the idol. They recited prayers, but they could not coordinate. One thought he was praising, another thought he was being cursed. They pushed each other, tore down the altar hangings, and the idol remained silent. Groups formed around shared language, rapid, involuntary, and exclusionary. Those who understood each other clustered together like crystals forming around a seed. Those who did not were pushed away. Friends who had worked side by side for years were suddenly foreigners. The mistrust was immediate. The hostility was instinctive. The construction stopped. Not because the materials ran out, not because the engineering failed, but because the builders could no longer say to each other, "Hand me that brick." The most ambitious construction project in the post-flood world was killed by the inability to communicate. Nimrod, standing at the top of his unfinished tower, saw it all. His workers threw down their tools. His soldiers could not understand their commanders. His priests could not coordinate their rituals. The wind stirred his robes. His golden crown slipped from his forehead. He shouted, "Order! Discipline! I am your king!" But his words tumbled like stones into the void. No one responded, and if they did, it was in languages he could not recognize. He descended the tower step by step, slowly, as if each step weighed an eternity. And when he reached the ground, he was no longer a king. He was just a man. He walked through the wreckage of the market, crushed fruit, torn fabric, tools abandoned in the mud. He arrived at the temple, stood before the great idol, and raised his arms. "Answer me! Give me back my empire! Make them listen to me!" The echo of his voice resounded off the walls, but the idol did not move. Not a blink, not a breeze, just silence. A silence heavier than 1,000 defeats. And Nimrod fell to his knees. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, records that the remnant of the tower was still visible in his time, nearly 2,000 years after its construction. Modern archaeology has identified several candidate sites in southern Iraq, most prominently the foundation platform of the Etemenanki ziggurat in the ancient city of Babylon, near modern Hilla, as the possible remains of the original structure, or at least a later rebuilding on the same site. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king who destroyed Solomon's temple in 586 BC, restored the Etemenanki and boasted in an inscription that he had raised its top to rival heaven. The same phrase, the same ambition, 2,000 years later. And then the scattering. The very thing the tower had been built to prevent happened anyway. Genesis 11:8. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. The scattering was not orderly. It was not planned. Groups formed around shared language and began to move, not by choice but by necessity and, as the text implies, by divine impulse. A man sitting beside a dead oven muttered hopelessly, "Bread. I need bread." A few steps away, another man raised his head. His eyes widened. He approached. "Did you say bread?" They looked at each other. They understood each other. And in that moment, a spark of connection ignited amidst the ashes. Small groups, then tribes, then whole clans began to gather by tongue. They collected what little they had, pots, tools, animals, and marched into the unknown. Some went north toward the mountains of Anatolia, where they would become the peoples who inhabited the great northern plains. Others followed the Tigris and Euphrates eastward toward Persia and eventually the Indus Valley. Some descended south into the Arabian Peninsula, where they would build mud houses and skin tents and form the tribes that centuries later would be known as the Arab peoples. Others sailed across unknown seas, the wind carrying them to islands, jungles, distant continents. The peoples of Africa, of the Pacific Islands, of the Americas. Each group carried with them their words, their songs, their memories of the tower, and the religious patterns that had been forged in Shinar under Nimrod's rule. And here is the detail that transforms this story from a local catastrophe into a theological framework for all of human history. The scattering was not a clean break. The 70 nations that emerged from Babel did not walk away from Nimrod's ideology. They carried it with them. Every nation that spread across the face of the earth carried in its cultural memory the religious patterns, the mythological frameworks, and the theological rebellions that had been forged under Nimrod. The confusion of languages fractured the political unity. It did not fracture the spiritual corruption. But God's response to Babel was not only judgment, it was also a countermove, and it came in the very next chapter of Genesis, after the scattering of the nations, after the Table of Nations documents the 70 peoples spreading across the earth. Genesis 12 opens with 5 words that change everything. The Lord said to Abram. God chose one man from Ur of the Chaldeans, from the very region where Nimrod had built his empire, and called him out. Leave your country, leave your family, go to a land I will show you. And the promise attached to that call was the direct reversal of Babel. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. All families, all nations. The 70 peoples who had been scattered would, through Abraham's seed, be gathered back, not by a tower, but by a promise, not by human engineering, but by divine grace. The entire rest of the Bible, from Abraham to Moses to David to the prophets to the Incarnation, is God's answer to the Tower of Babel. The scattering was not the end, it was the setup. God divided humanity at Babel so that he could reunite it through a plan that no human ambition could corrupt, because the reunification would not come from below. It would come from above. The worship of the deified king, the God-man, the divine tyrant, appears in the religious traditions of nearly every subsequent ancient civilization, refracted through different languages, but recognizably the same figure. In Sumer, the deified kings of the king list. In Babylon, the worship of Marduk. In Assyria, the war god Ashur. In Egypt, the divine Pharaoh, a man who is also a god. In Canaan, Baal. In Greece, the myths of titans who warred against the gods and were cast down. Wherever the 70 nations went, they carried Babel with them. The languages changed. The names changed. The rituals adapted to local geography, but the core theological error, the belief that humanity could become divine, that a man could be God, that heaven could be stormed and occupied by mortal ambition, survived the scattering intact. The Hebrew prophets understood this. When Isaiah described the fall of Babylon in chapter 14, he used language that mirrors the tower builders precisely. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will make myself like the Most High. The ambition is identical. Ascend, conquer, replace, become God. And it is no accident that in the final book of the Christian Bible, the Revelation of John, the great enemy of God in the last days is called Babylon. Not Rome, not any modern nation. Babylon. The name of Nimrod's capital, the name that means in Hebrew, confusion. 3,000 years after the tower fell, the prophetic imagination still reached for Babel as the ultimate symbol of human rebellion against the divine. But there is a counter-narrative in Scripture that reverses Babel with surgical precision, and it happens in Acts chapter 2. At Pentecost, 50 days after the resurrection, the Holy Spirit descended on the disciples gathered in an upper room in Jerusalem. A sound like a violent rushing wind filled the house. Tongues of fire appeared and rested on each person, and they began speaking in languages they had never learned. Parthian, Median, Elamite, Egyptian, Cretan, Arabic, the languages of the nations scattered at Babel. Pilgrims from every corner of the known world heard the message of God in their own native tongue. The crowd was astonished. Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? What God had divided at Babel, the Spirit reunited at Pentecost. The curse was not removed, the languages remained different, but the barrier was overcome. The message of the gospel crossed every linguistic boundary that Babel had created, and it has been crossing them ever since. Translated into over 3,000 languages, carried to every continent, proclaimed in every dialect the scattering produced. The symmetry between Babel and Pentecost is not accidental. It is theological architecture. At Babel, humanity spoke one language and used it to rebel against God, so God divided the languages. At Pentecost, God's Spirit spoke through human mouths in every language simultaneously, reuniting what had been divided, but on God's terms, not Nimrod's. The tower tried to reach heaven by human effort. The Spirit descended from heaven by divine choice. Babel built up. Pentecost came down. And the God who confused the languages at Shinar restored communication at Jerusalem, not through bricks and tar, but through fire and wind and the voice of fishermen speaking words they had never learned to people they had never met. The reversal was complete. The plan that began with Abraham's call in Genesis 12, "In you all families of the earth shall be blessed," reached its fulfillment in a room in Jerusalem, where a dozen Galileans preached to the nations in the nation's own tongues. Babel scattered, Pentecost gathered, and the gathering has never stopped. The tower is gone. Its bricks have dissolved back into the Mesopotamian mud from which they were fired. Its bitumen has crumbled. Its ramps are dust. Its summit, which never reached heaven, is a flat expanse where the wind blows unobstructed across southern Iraq. But the shadow of Babel has never faded. Every empire since has been a Babel. Every tyrant since has been a Nimrod. Every ideology that promises humanity can perfect itself, transcend its nature, and storm the gates of heaven by the sheer force of collective will is building the same tower with the same bricks aimed at the same sky. And the God who came down to see it the first time is still watching. What struck you most? 3 generations from Noah to Nimrod, the name that means, "Let us rebel," God coming down to see the tower, or Pentecost reversing Babel? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one.